Have you ever thought about camping in your backyard? Sounds harmless, doesn't it? A quiet retreat just steps from your home, where nothing could possibly go wrong. But what if I told you that the safest place you know can hide the darkest secrets? What if I told you that a single night in your own backyard could change your life forever? This story is not about some faraway forest or an isolated campground. It happened right here in suburbia. It happened to me. And by the end of it, you'll think twice about stepping into your own backyard at night. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you've ever had a creepy experience while camping, let me know in the comments below. Let's see if anyone else has stories like this. Now, let's get into it. You won't believe what happened that night. Growing up in the suburbs of Idaho, I always dreamed of adventures in the wild. My family wasn't the kind to venture into remote forests or mountain ranges, but we had plenty of weekend camping trips to local spots, safe, controlled, and well-maintained. My parents were protective like that, never letting me camp out alone, not even in our own backyard. They always said it wasn't about what was out there, but who might be watching from the shadows. As a kid, I thought they were just being overprotective. The idea of danger lurking in the quiet corners of our neighborhood seemed ridiculous. After all, we lived in a safe area, the kind of place where neighbors waved as they mowed their lawns and kids rode their bikes until sundown. What could possibly go wrong in a backyard surrounded by a wooden fence and the glow of porch lights? But now, looking back, I wonder if my parents knew something I didn't. Fast forward to adulthood. I'm 29, and life has kept me busy. Between work and the usual grind, I'd almost forgotten about those carefree camping trips. That is, until last fall, when I was cleaning out my garage and stumbled upon our old camping gear. Seeing the worn tent and the slightly rusty lantern brought back a flood of memories. The smell of marshmallows roasting, the sound of crickets chirping, and the cool night breeze on my face. It all felt like a piece of me I'd lost. That's when the idea struck me. Why not camp in my backyard? Seemed so simple, so nostalgic. The weather was perfect, crisp but not too cold, with the scent of fallen leaves lingering in the air. I didn't have the time to drive out to a campsite, and besides, there was something oddly comforting about being close to home. My backyard was spacious enough, bordered by tall wooden fences and a few clusters of trees that gave it a semi-woodsy feel. It was perfect. I spent the entire afternoon preparing. First, I set up my tent, an old but sturdy model that had seen its fair share of camping trips. Next, I cleared a small patch of ground for a makeshift fire pit, carefully arranging stones in a neat circle. I even dragged out a couple of lawn chairs to complete the campsite vibe. By the time the sun started dipping below the horizon, casting golden rays through the trees, I was feeling a childlike excitement I hadn't experienced in years. As I sat by the small fire I'd built, toasting marshmallows and flipping through an old camping guidebook, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. It felt so silly to be camping in my own backyard, like playing pretend. But there was also something freeing about it. I didn't have to worry about work, bills, or even checking my phone. For the first time in a long while, I felt disconnected, and I liked it. But as the darkness deepened and the firelight flickered against the trees, an unsettling thought crept into my mind. Had anyone else ever camped in their backyard and felt like they weren't alone? Surely, it was just my imagination, right? As the evening settled into full darkness, the world around me transformed. The backyard I knew so well during the day felt different at night. Bigger, quieter, and strangely alive. The wooden fence, once a boundary of safety, now seemed more like a barrier keeping something unknown out. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows dancing on the tent's fabric like ghostly fingers. It was both exhilarating and unnerving. I kept the fire going, its crackling sound comforting in the stillness. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant bark of a neighborhood dog or the faint hum of a passing car, reminders that I wasn't completely alone. Yet, there was an odd sensation I couldn't shake, like the backyard was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I laughed at myself, brushing it off as the kind of overthinking that comes with being alone in the dark. Sitting by the fire, I found myself reminiscing about my childhood. I remembered how I used to beg my parents to let me sleep outside, insisting I was old enough to handle it. My dad always said, "When you're older, you'll understand why we say no." At the time, I thought he meant I'd be too busy with adult life to care about something as simple as backyard camping. But now, as I sat there alone, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something else. Something he didn't want to explain outright. I finished my marshmallows and leaned back in the lawn chair, staring up at the sky. The stars were breathtaking, clearer than I'd ever noticed before. The firelight cast a warm glow, but beyond its reach, the backyard faded into an inky blackness that seemed endless. It was strange how familiar things could feel so foreign at night. I could see my house, just a short walk away, its windows glowing softly with the light from the kitchen. The sight of it should have comforted me, but instead, it reminded me how far I felt from safety. Around 10 p.m., I decided to wind down. I doused the fire with dirt and water, making sure there were no stray embers left behind. The backyard plunged into darkness, lit only by the small lantern I had brought with me. Its light was dim, flickering slightly, but it was enough to guide me as I crawled into my tent. Once inside, I zipped up the door and settled into my sleeping bag. Lying there, I tried to relax. The sounds of the night were louder now. Crickets chirping in a steady rhythm, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the wind brushing against the tent. It was peaceful, but every so often, I thought I heard something else. A faint crunch of grass, a distant shuffle. My rational mind insisted it was nothing, probably just a raccoon or the wind. But my gut told me to stay alert. I told myself it was just first-night jitters. After all, it was only my backyard. What could possibly happen here? When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Too quiet. The usual morning symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves was nowhere to be found. It was unsettling, like the world was holding its breath. I stretched inside my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the stiffness from a restless night. My mind drifted back to the faint noises I'd heard the night before, but I quickly brushed them aside. It was probably just the wind or a stray animal, right? I unzipped the tent door and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden glow across the backyard. The fire pit was just a pile of ash now, and the grass was damp with dew. It looked so peaceful, almost enough to make me forget how on edge I'd felt the night before. Almost. As I stretched my arms and turned to head back toward the house, something caught my eye. Just a few feet from the tent, near the edge of the fire pit, the grass was disturbed. I crouched down for a closer look and froze. There, imprinted in the soft dirt around the pit, were footprints, large ones, much larger than mine. They were deep, as if whoever had made them was carrying something heavy or moving deliberately. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity, my brain scrambling for an explanation. Maybe my brother, David, had come by to check on me during the night? But no, that didn't make sense. David wasn't even staying over, and these prints didn't look like they belonged to him. They were too big, too deliberate. My stomach churned as the realization sank in. Someone had been here. I looked around the yard, scanning for anything else out of place. My tent seemed untouched, and the lawn chairs were still in their spots. But then I noticed something else. On the side of the RV, just above the wheel well, there were faint scratch marks. They weren't deep, but they were long and jagged, like someone had dragged a knife or another sharp object across the surface. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped closer to the RV, running my fingers over the scratches. They weren't there yesterday. I was sure of it. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it have been a neighbor's prank? A random trespasser? Or something worse? My dog, Max, trotted up from the house, his tail wagging lazily. He sniffed the ground near the fire pit, then froze, his ears perked up. He let out a low growl, staring at the line of trees near the back fence. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and the faint sway of branches in the breeze. "Come on, Max," I whispered, trying to sound calm. But inside, I was anything but. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me, and maybe they still were. As I lay in the tent that night, the familiar sounds of the crickets and the wind should have lulled me to sleep, but something felt off. The backyard, so ordinary by day, seemed alive with an unsettling energy. I heard faint crunches in the distance. Probably a raccoon, I told myself. But was it? And what about the strange quiet that followed? The crickets had stopped. The air felt heavy. Was I overthinking it, or was someone or something out there? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt like you weren't alone in a familiar place? Don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Things are about to get much darker. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Too quiet. The usual morning symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves was nowhere to be found. It was unsettling, like the world was holding its breath. I stretched inside my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the stiffness from a restless night. My mind drifted back to the faint noises I'd heard the night before, but I quickly brushed them aside. It was probably just the wind or a stray animal, right? I unzipped the tent door and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden glow across the backyard. The fire pit was just a pile of ash now, and the grass was damp with dew. It looked so peaceful, almost enough to make me forget how on edge I'd felt the night before. Almost. As I stretched my arms and turned to head back toward the house, something caught my eye. Just a few feet from the tent, near the edge of the fire pit, the grass was disturbed. I crouched down for a closer look and froze. There, imprinted in the soft dirt around the pit, were footprints, large ones, much larger than mine. They were deep, as if whoever had made them was carrying something heavy or moving deliberately. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity, my brain scrambling for an explanation. Maybe my brother, David, had come by to check on me during the night? But no, that didn't make sense. David wasn't even staying over, and these prints didn't look like they belonged to him. They were too big, too deliberate. My stomach churned as the realization sank in. Someone had been here. I looked around the yard, scanning for anything else out of place. My tent seemed untouched, and the lawn chairs were still in their spots. But then I noticed something else. On the side of the RV, just above the wheel well, there were faint scratch marks. They weren't deep, but they were long and jagged, like someone had dragged a knife or another sharp object across the surface. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped closer to the RV, running my fingers over the scratches. They weren't there yesterday. I was sure of it. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it have been a neighbor's prank? A random trespasser? Or something worse? My dog, Max, trotted up from the house, his tail wagging lazily. He sniffed the ground near the fire pit, then froze, his ears perked up. He let out a low growl, staring at the line of trees near the back fence. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint sway of branches in the breeze. "Come on, Max," I whispered, trying to sound calm, but inside I was anything but. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me, and maybe they still were. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The footprints, the scratches, Max's sudden growling. It was all too much to brush off as a coincidence. My backyard, which had always been a place of safety and familiarity, now felt like uncharted territory. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. Even the trees that I once admired for their beauty now loomed over me like silent sentinels, hiding secrets in their darkened branches. Max's growl deepened, pulling me back to the moment. His eyes were fixed on the tree-line, unblinking, his posture rigid. I followed his gaze again, squinting into the shadows, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, his reaction wasn't something I could ignore. Max wasn't the kind of dog to get spooked easily. He'd grown up around plenty of wildlife and loud noises. Whatever had him on edge wasn't just a squirrel or a passing bird. "Max, it's okay," I said, more to reassure myself than him. I reached down to pat his head, but he didn't budge. Instead, He let out a sharp bark that echoed across the yard. My heart jumped at the sound, and I instinctively turned toward the house, glancing at the windows to see if my parents had noticed. No movement. They were probably still asleep. Max's barking seemed to ease after a moment, and he finally broke his gaze from the trees. He trotted over to me, his tail wagging nervously, like he was trying to reassure me that the danger, whatever it was, had passed. But I wasn't so sure. I decided to take another look around the yard, starting with the fire pit where the footprints had been. As I examined them more closely, I noticed something strange. The tracks didn't lead away from the pit. They seemed to stop abruptly, as if whoever or whatever had been there had simply vanished. No trail heading toward the fence, no scuffed grass leading to the gate, just those deep, solitary prints. Maybe it was a dream, I muttered under my breath, though I didn't believe it for a second. My hands trembled as I stood up, brushing the dirt off my knees. Maybe someone just passed through during the night and left. But why? And why here? As I circled the RV, I found more scratches, this time on the back corner near the taillight. They weren't as deep as the ones on the side, but they were fresh, the kind of marks you'd expect from something deliberate. I felt my chest tighten as the thought crept in. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They were looking for something or someone. Max let out a soft whine, brushing against my leg as if to say, "Let's go inside." I didn't need any more convincing. I hurried back toward the house, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. As I reached the door, I hesitated, taking one last look at the backyard. It was quiet again, too quiet, and for the first time I realized I wasn't entirely sure I was alone. Back inside the house, the warm, familiar scent of coffee brewing greeted me, but it did little to calm my nerves. My parents were sitting at the kitchen table, casually chatting as if everything was perfectly normal. I envied their calmness, but I wasn't about to share what I'd just seen. Not yet, anyway. I didn't want to sound paranoid or worse, like I couldn't handle a simple camping trip in my own backyard. "Morning, sweetheart," my mom said, smiling over her mug. "How was your first night out there?" I hesitated, my mind racing for a response that wouldn't raise any alarms. "It was good," I said, forcing a smile. "A little colder than I expected, but not bad." "Cold?" My dad chuckled. "That's camping for you. Builds character." "Yeah," I muttered, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting down with them. Max curled up at my feet, but his usual relaxed demeanor was replaced with a nervous energy. His ears twitched at every little sound, and I could feel his body tense against my legs. "You sure you're okay?" Mom asked, narrowing her eyes. "You look a little off." I waved it off quickly. "I'm fine, just didn't sleep great. First night jitters, I guess." Dad raised an eyebrow. "Jitters? In your own backyard?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice steady. It's weird being out there alone. I kept thinking I heard things, but it was probably just the wind or some animal. Mom nodded sympathetically, but Dad leaned back in his chair, giving me that look, the one that said he wasn't buying it. I avoided his gaze and took a long sip of coffee, hoping the caffeine would calm me down. Didn't. After breakfast, I decided to head back outside and tidy up the campsite, hoping the daylight would make me feel less ridiculous about the night before. I told myself that if I could just get through one more night, I'd prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. It was probably just my imagination, or so I hoped. As I approached the RV, Max trotted ahead of me, his tail wagging slightly but still not as relaxed as usual. The sight of the scratches on the RV's side in the harsh morning light sent another chill down my spine. They were even more pronounced now, jagged lines that didn't look random. They looked intentional, deliberate. I grabbed a rag and started wiping at them, as if scrubbing them away would erase the unease they'd brought with them. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A small clump of dried mud stuck to the base of the RV. It didn't look like it had come from the yard. The texture and color were different, like it had been tracked in from somewhere else, somewhere farther away. Max barked sharply, pulling me out of my thoughts. He was standing near the edge of the tree line, his body rigid, ears pointed straight ahead. My heart pounded as I turned to look. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to shift, almost like something was moving, or someone. "Come on, Max," I said, my voice trembling, but he didn't move. He just kept staring into the trees. And for the first time, I wondered if whatever or whoever had been in my yard last night was still out there. Max's barking grew louder, sharper, and more insistent. It was a sound I hadn't heard from him before. Deep, guttural, almost frantic. My stomach twisted as I followed his gaze into the tree-line. At first, it looked like nothing was there, just the usual play of light and shadow among the leaves. But then, something shifted. A dark figure moved just slightly, enough for me to catch the outline of a person. I froze. My first instinct was to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing games after the strange night I'd had. But Max didn't stop barking. His growls turned into sharp, angry barks as he lunged toward the fence, his entire body trembling with tension. I took a shaky step back, clutching the RV for support. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking. "Is someone there?" No answer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, half hidden in the shadows. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. Who would be in my backyard this early in the morning? And why weren't they responding? "Max, come," I commanded, my voice louder now, more urgent. Max hesitated for a moment, growling at the figure one last time before reluctantly retreating to my side. I bent down and grabbed his collar, my hands trembling as I tried to calm both of us down. I glanced back toward the tree-line, but the figure was gone. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The shadows danced as the breeze swayed the trees, but there was nothing else. It was as if whoever or whatever I'd seen had vanished into thin air. I knew I should go back to the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving my campsite now would somehow be giving in, admitting that I was scared. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a neighbor cutting through the woods, or someone out for an early walk. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The way they'd stood there, so still, so deliberate, it wasn't normal. Trying to regain my composure, I busied myself by tidying up the campsite. I folded the lawn chairs and straightened the tent, all the while keeping one eye on the tree-line. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at every sound. I couldn't tell if he was calming down or just waiting for something else to happen. By the time I finished, the sun was fully up, and the warmth of the morning light brought a small sense of relief. But as I headed back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder one last time and froze. There, just behind the tree line, was a single footprint in the dirt. It was deep, larger than my own, and pointed directly toward my campsite. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed Max and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going away, and I still had another night to get through. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. I tried to focus on normal activities, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure in the trees and the footprint by the campsite. I told myself I was overthinking it, making something out of nothing. But no matter how many times I replayed the morning in my head, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Max, on the other hand, stayed unusually alert. He followed me everywhere, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. It was comforting having him close, but it also heightened my anxiety. He was sensing something I couldn't see. By late afternoon, I decided I had to confront my fear head-on. I wasn't about to let paranoia ruin what was supposed to be a fun, nostalgic weekend. If I gave in to the unease, I'd be running inside every time I heard a branch snap. And honestly, it felt silly to be scared in my own backyard. So I made a plan. For the second night, I'd be more prepared. I packed a small bag with essentials, my phone, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and Max's leash. If something happened, I wanted to be ready. I even grabbed an old can of bear spray from the garage, though it was probably expired. It felt ridiculous, but it also gave me a small sense of control. The evening rolled in with a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry leaves. I set up a small fire again, determined to create the same cozy atmosphere as the night before. The flames danced, casting warm, flickering light against the RV and surrounding trees. For a while, I let myself relax. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire and shared scraps with Max, who seemed content enough to sit close to me, his tail wagging softly. But as the sky darkened, the familiar unease crept back in. The trees around the yard seemed to shift and stretch, their shadows growing longer and darker. Even with the fire burning brightly, the corners of the yard felt unnervingly empty, like they were waiting to be filled. I found myself glancing at the treeline more often than I wanted to admit. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Logic told me it was the wind, but my gut said otherwise. It wasn't the sound itself that bothered me. It was the timing. The noises weren't constant like normal background activity. They came in bursts, deliberate and spaced out, like someone or something was testing my reaction. By 10 p.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to walk the perimeter of the yard, hoping to put my mind at ease. Max padded along beside me, his nose low to the ground. As we approached the treeline, I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't realized how dark it had gotten. So dark that the firelight barely reached us. That's when Max stopped dead in his tracks. His ears perked and his body tense. A low growl rumbled in his chest as he stared into the shadows. I followed his gaze, squinting into the blackness. First, I saw nothing. But then, just for a moment, I caught a flicker of movement. A shadow shifting where no shadow should be. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was out there. And this time, they weren't hiding. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest so loudly I was sure Max could hear it. His growl deepened, his hackles raised as he stood firm beside me. Whatever or whoever was out there, he didn't like it. And neither did I. For a long moment, everything seemed to stand still. The world around me held its breath, the fire behind me crackling faintly in the distance. I kept my eyes locked on the spot where I'd seen the shadow move, hoping, praying, that I was imagining things. But then it happened again. A deliberate shift, the outline of a figure stepping ever so slightly closer to the edge of the trees. I clenched Max's leash tightly, my hand trembling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky but louder than I expected. The words felt strange in the heavy silence, as if they didn't belong. No response. I took a cautious step back, pulling Max with me. He resisted, his focus still locked on the figure in the shadows. The firelight barely reached the edge of the yard, leaving the treeline cloaked in darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight in my bag, my fingers shaking as I finally clicked it on. The beam cut through the night, illuminating the spot where I'd seen the movement. Nothing. The trees stood still, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The figure was gone or hiding. My stomach twisted as I scanned the area, moving the flashlight beam back and forth. I couldn't see anything out of place, but that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made everything worse. The unknown was always scarier than what you could see. I started backing toward the campsite, my steps slow and deliberate. Max walked beside me now, still tense but moving with me. I kept the flashlight trained on the treeline, half expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a trespasser? A neighbor? A harmless camper who'd wandered too far? Or something else entirely? As I reached the fire, I felt a fleeting sense of safety in the warm glow. I crouched beside Max, trying to steady my breathing. My hand instinctively moved to the can of bear spray clipped to my bag, its weight comforting. I wasn't sure if it still worked, but it was better than nothing. For a few minutes, the backyard was silent again, except for the crackle of the fire and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I started to convince myself that it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe it really had been my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere and lack of sleep. Then I heard it, a distinct, deliberate sound, a low, scraping noise, like metal dragging against wood. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from the direction of the RV. I swung the flashlight toward it, the beam bouncing wildly as my hand shook. There, on the side of the RV, was the faintest glint of metal. Someone was standing there, and they weren't trying to hide anymore. The glint of metal sent a jolt of fear through my entire body. I tightened my grip on Max's leash as the figure stepped into view. The firelight illuminated just enough for me to make out their shape. A tall, broad figure draped in dark clothing. They were holding something long and sharp in their hand. A knife. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the distance between us feeling both impossibly far and terrifyingly close. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Max barked sharply, his teeth bared, ready to lunge. The sound shattered the silence, and the figure tilted their head slightly, as if they were sizing us up. I forced myself to move, backing up toward the house as slowly as I could without turning my back on the stranger. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every step felt like it took an eternity. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the night. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they took a step closer, their movements deliberate, almost methodical. The knife glinted again in the firelight, and I realized with horrifying clarity that they weren't here by accident. They had been watching me, waiting. My hand fumbled for the bear spray clipped to my bag. I yanked it free, my fingers trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. "I'm armed." I lied, hoping the bluff would make them think twice. "I'll call the police." Another step closer. They were only a few yards away now, and I could see their face more clearly. It was partially obscured by a hood, but what I could see made my stomach churn. A crooked smile stretched across their lips, as if they were enjoying this. I couldn't wait any longer. My hand shot out, and I sprayed the bear spray in their direction. The mist exploded into the air, and Max barked furiously as I tugged him back. The figure stumbled, raising a hand to shield their face. For a moment, they were thrown off balance, coughing and swiping at their eyes. "Run, Max!" I shouted, yanking him toward the house. My legs finally found their strength, and we bolted across the yard. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the figure behind me, their heavy footsteps pounding against the ground. I reached the back door, fumbling with the handle as panic took over. Max barked and growled, his body pressed against my leg as if to protect me. Finally, the door swung open, and we rushed inside. I slammed it shut and locked it, pressing my back against the door as I struggled to catch my breath. For a moment, everything was silent except for my pounding heart and Max's heavy breathing. Then, from outside, I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating, followed by the eerie creak of the backyard gate swinging open. Whoever they were gone, for now. But I knew this wasn't over. I sat on the floor of the kitchen, my back pressed against the locked door, heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. Max paced nervously beside me, his ears perked and his nose twitching at every sound. The house was silent, almost oppressively so, except for the faint tick of the clock on the wall. My breathing finally began to slow, but my mind raced with questions. Who was that person? What did they want? And most importantly, would they come back? I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed my brother, David. If anyone would know what to do, it was him. The phone rang once, twice, and then his groggy voice answered. "Melissa? What time is it?" He mumbled, clearly annoyed. "David?" I whispered, my voice shaky. Someone was in the backyard. They had a knife. That woke him up. "Wait, what? Are you okay? Are Mom and Dad okay?" "We're fine," I said, glancing around the room as if expecting the intruder to appear at any moment. "Max scared them off, I think. But I don't know if they're gone for good." "Did you call the police?" he asked, his voice now sharp and urgent. I hesitated. Calling the police felt like the logical thing to do, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of not being taken seriously, or maybe it was the surreal nature of the situation, like reporting it would make it all too real. "Not yet," I admitted. "Melissa," David sighed, exasperated. "You need to call them. This isn't something you handle on your own. I'll head over right now, but call them. Promise me." "I will," I said, though the words felt hollow. I wasn't sure I believed myself. After we hung up, I sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. Max whined softly, nuzzling my arm as if to reassure me. I gave his head a gentle pat and forced myself to stand. My legs felt like jelly, but I knew I couldn't just sit there all night. I double-checked every lock in the house, starting with the back door and moving through the windows. Each turn of the lock gave me a small sense of security, though it did little to calm the storm in my mind. By the time I finished, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me feeling drained and shaky. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave the kitchen. The backyard loomed just beyond the darkened windows, a shadowy void that seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. I stared out into the night, my reflection faintly visible in the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of shadow just beyond the fire pit. But when I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew the truth. The night wasn't over, and neither was the danger. I couldn't sit still, the feeling of being watched pressing down on me like a weight. Every creak of the house, every faint rustle of wind outside, sent my heart racing. I kept glancing at the clock, willing time to move faster. David had promised to come over, but I knew it would take him at least 30 minutes. And that was assuming nothing went wrong on the way. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. His presence was comforting, but I could tell he was still on edge. I thought about calling the police, just as David had said, but the thought of trying to explain everything, footprints, scratches, and a shadowy figure, made me hesitate. What if they didn't take me seriously? What if they came out and found nothing, making me look paranoid? I tried to distract myself by tidying up the kitchen, but my hands were shaking too badly to do anything productive. Instead, I ended up pacing back and forth, my eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. The darkness outside felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the back of the house. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it. But as I stood there, holding my breath, the sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers against the glass. Max's growl confirmed what I already feared. He stood at attention, his body tense as he stared at the back door. I followed his gaze, my stomach churning. The porch light was off, leaving the backyard shrouded in darkness. I couldn't see anything beyond the faint reflection of the kitchen in the glass, but the tapping continued, slow and steady. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and flicked it on. My fingers trembled as I aimed the beam at the door, illuminating the glass with a harsh white light. For a moment, there was nothing, just the empty porch and the dark yard beyond. And then something moved. A figure darted out of the flashlight's beam, disappearing into the shadows near the RV. My heart nearly stopped. They were back, and this time they were bold enough to get close. Max barked furiously, his body lunging toward the door. I grabbed his collar, holding him back as he snarled and growled. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I tried to think. Should I call the police now? Should I wait for David? What if they tried to break in before anyone could help? The tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the windows, one by one, as if the intruder was circling the house. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse, far worse. The silence was suffocating, the kind that made your ears strain to hear something, anything, just to fill the void. Max stood rigid beside me, his growling reduced to a low rumble in his chest. He stared intently at the window, his body tense like a coiled spring ready to snap. My hands trembled as I held the flashlight, its beam fixed on the window where the tapping had stopped. "Okay, Melissa," I whispered to myself, trying to calm down. "Think. What do you do now?" The logical answer was to call the police, but fear clouded my judgment. What if they came and the intruder was already gone? What if they found nothing, and I was left to deal with this alone again? My thoughts were spiraling, each one worse than the last. I needed to do something, anything, to feel in control. I grabbed Max's leash, clipping it to his collar with shaking hands. "Come on, buddy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to check it out." Max wagged his tail slightly, his eyes still fixed on the window. He didn't seem scared, more like he was ready for a fight. That gave me a small spark of courage as I led him to the back door. I turned off the flashlight and took a deep breath before flipping the porch light on. The backyard was bathed in an eerie yellow glow, the shadows from the trees stretching long and thin across the grass. I scanned the yard, searching for any sign of movement. The RV sat silent and still, the fire pit a dark circle of ash. Everything looked normal, too normal. Max tugged at the leash, pulling me toward the door. He barked once, a sharp sound that echoed through the night. I hesitated for a moment before slowly unlocking the door and cracking it open. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and leaves. My heart raced as I stepped outside, Max leading the way. The yard felt different at night, the familiar space now a maze of shadows and hidden corners. Max sniffed the ground, his nose working overtime as he pulled me toward the RV. The scratches I'd seen earlier that day seemed even more sinister in the dim light, the jagged lines glinting faintly under the porch lamp. And then I saw it. Just beyond the RV, near the edge of the treeline, something glinted in the grass. It was small and metallic, reflecting the light in a way that caught my attention immediately. I moved closer, Max at my side, and crouched down to get a better look. It was a knife, the same knife I'd seen the figure holding earlier. Its blade was long and serrated, the handle wrapped in dark tape. My stomach churned as I realized they must have dropped it while circling the yard. I reached out to grab it, but stopped when I noticed something else. A faint trail of footprints leading from the RV to the treeline. The trail disappeared into the darkness of the woods, but it was clear enough to know one thing. Whoever had been here was still out there. I stared at the knife for what felt like an eternity, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear and disbelief. It was real. This wasn't just paranoia or my imagination running wild. Someone had been here, creeping through my yard, and they'd left behind a weapon. Part of me wanted to leave it there, untouched, but I couldn't risk letting it stay. What if they came back for it? Carefully, I picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through my hand. The blade was slightly stained. Mud, I told myself, though my stomach churned at the thought of what else it might be. Max stood beside me, still tense, his nose pointed toward the treeline. His low growl reminded me that we weren't safe yet. I turned back toward the house, clutching the knife tightly, when a sudden noise stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't the wind or a distant sound from the neighborhood. It was close, too close, a deliberate crack of a branch, coming from the trees. Max barked sharply, lunging toward the treeline, his leash straining in my grip. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense woods just beyond the fence. At first, I saw nothing but tangled branches and shifting shadows. But then something moved, a figure. They were partially obscured by the trees, but I could see enough to make out their outline. Tall, broad, and unmistakably human. They stood there, motionless, just watching. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. They weren't running away. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted me to see them. "Get out of here," I shouted, my voice cracking as I raised the knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. "I'll call the police. You're on camera." It was a bluff. I didn't have any cameras, but I hoped it would scare them off. They didn't move. For a moment, the only sound was Max's barking and the blood rushing in my ears. And then, slowly, deliberately, the figure raised their hand. At first, I thought they might be surrendering, but then I saw the object in their grasp. A crowbar, glinting faintly in the light. Panic surged through me. I yanked Max's leash and backed toward the house, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on them. Not when they were so close. "Max, let's go," I hissed, my voice shaking. He hesitated, growling at the figure one last time before following me. We moved quickly, my eyes darting between the house and the shadowy figure. Every step felt like it took an eternity. Finally, we reached the back door. I threw it open and pushed Max inside, slamming it shut behind us. My hands fumbled to lock it, my breathing ragged. I pressed my back against the door, clutching the knife and flashlight like lifelines. Outside, the porch light flickered, and just beyond the glow, I thought I saw the figure step closer to the house before disappearing into the night. The house felt eerily quiet after I slammed the door shut. Max sat by my side, still growling softly, his eyes fixed on the window as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. I couldn't stop clutching the knife, its cold handle digging into my palm, grounding me in the moment. I glanced at the clock. David should have been here by now. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called him again, pressing the phone to my ear as I kept my eyes locked on the darkened windows. The call went straight to voicemail. "David, where are you? Someone's here. Please call me back. Hurry." I whispered, my voice trembling. I hung up and stared at the screen, willing him to call me back, but it stayed silent. A sudden sound broke the silence. A heavy thud against the back door. Max jumped to his feet, barking furiously as he pressed his paws against the door. I staggered backward, my grip tightening on the knife. Another thud came, louder this time, rattling the door in its frame. "Whoever you are, I'm calling the police," I screamed, trying to make my voice sound braver than I felt. My hand hovered over the emergency call button, but I froze when I heard a low, guttural laugh from the other side of the door. The laugh chilled me to my core. It wasn't loud or maniacal. It was quiet, almost mocking, as if whoever was out there found my fear amusing. Max barked even louder, throwing himself against the door in a desperate attempt to get at the intruder. I reached out to grab his collar, pulling him back. Then, the sound of glass shattering erupted from the side of the house. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had broken a window. I bolted for the kitchen, Max hot on my heels, and grabbed the largest knife I could find from the block. The broken window was in the living room, shards of glass glinting on the floor. The curtains fluttered slightly in the cool night breeze. My stomach dropped as I realized the figure could be inside already. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice breaking. My eyes darted around the room, searching for movement. Max growled low, his body tense as he sniffed the air. The silence stretched out, unbearable, until a faint sound came from the hallway. A creak, like someone stepping on the old wooden floorboards. My chest tightened as I turned toward the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Who's there?" I called out, though I didn't expect an answer. A shadow moved at the edge of the hallway, just out of reach of the light. My breath caught as the figure stepped into view, holding the crowbar in one hand. They didn't speak, didn't lunge, just stood there, staring at me with a cold, predatory intensity. This wasn't just a break-in. This was a hunt. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The figure stood at the end of the hallway, their face partially obscured by the shadows. But I could see enough. The glint of the crowbar in their hand, the slow, deliberate way they tilted their head, as if studying me. My throat went dry, and my grip tightened on the knife. Max let out a low growl, his body rigid beside me. "Get out of my house," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. "I've called the police. They're on their way." The figure didn't respond. Instead, they took a step forward, their boots thudding softly against the floor. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave Max or risk turning my back. I stood my ground, holding the knife out in front of me like a shield. Max barked furiously, lunging toward the figure, but I held him back by the leash. The intruder stopped, their head tilting again, as if amused by the dog's aggression. Then, without warning, they raised the crowbar and swung it against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the house, loud and jarring, sending shards of drywall flying. I flinched, my pulse racing. They were trying to scare me, to make me feel powerless. But I couldn't let them see how terrified I was. "I mean it," I yelled. "The cops are coming. Leave now and you might get away." Another step forward. This time, the crowbar dragged along the wall, creating a grating, metallic screech that set my teeth on edge. I backed up instinctively, pulling Max with me. My mind raced through my options. The back door was blocked, the window was shattered, and they were between me and the front door. I had one choice: fight or be cornered. With a deep breath, I summoned every ounce of courage I had. I lunged forward, slashing the knife through the air in a wide arc. The figure stopped abruptly, the crowbar raised defensively. For the first time, they seemed to hesitate, as if they hadn't expected me to fight back. Max took advantage of the moment, lunging forward with a growl so fierce it sent chills down my spine. The figure stumbled back, clearly thrown off by the dog's sudden aggression. I took the opportunity to grab a small side table from the hallway and hurl it toward them. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to make them stagger and drop the crowbar. "Get out!" I screamed, adrenaline fueling my movements. I swung the knife again, forcing them to retreat further into the hallway. The figure stared at me for a long moment, their breathing heavy and labored. Then, without a word, they turned and bolted toward the shattered window. I followed cautiously, Max barking at their heels, but they were fast, too fast. By the time I reached the window, they were gone, disappearing into the darkness outside. My hands shook violently as I locked the doors and grabbed my phone. This time, there was no hesitation. I dialed 911. I pressed the phone to my ear, barely able to keep my voice steady as the 911 operator answered. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone in my house," I said, my words tumbling out in a rush. "They broke in, smashed a window, and they had a weapon. They just ran out, but I don't know if they're gone for good. Please, send someone now." "Are you safe?" the operator asked, her voice calm and measured, which was the exact opposite of how I felt. "I think so," I said, glancing at Max, who stood by the shattered window, growling softly at the darkness outside. "They ran out the back window, but they might still be close." "Okay, stay on the line with me. Officers are on their way. Can you lock yourself in a room with your dog until they arrive?" "Yes, I can do that." My voice trembled, but I was already moving toward the bedroom, my knife still clutched in one hand. I guided Max with me, shutting the door firmly behind us and locking it. The room felt suffocatingly small as I listened to the operator's instructions. "Do you know if they're still on the property?" she asked. "No," I whispered, my ear pressed to the door. "But they've been watching me all night. They left their knife outside earlier, and now they smashed their way in with a crowbar. This wasn't random. They knew I was here. Help is almost there. Stay calm and keep your dog with you. Don't engage with anyone unless it's law enforcement." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. My pulse raced as I listened for any sound, any indication that the intruder had returned. Max sniffed at the door, letting out an occasional low growl that made my stomach twist. The silence outside was unbearable. Minutes dragged by like hours. Every creak of the house felt like a threat, every gust of wind like a warning. The sound of distant sirens finally broke through the tension, growing louder as they approached. Relief washed over me, though it was quickly replaced by fear. Would the police get here in time? Or was the intruder already planning their next move? The flashing red and blue lights reflected against the walls of my bedroom, casting an eerie glow through the curtains. I heard car doors slam and voices calling out. Max barked loudly, wagging his tail for the first time since the ordeal began. I unlocked the bedroom door and crept toward the front of the house, peeking out cautiously. "Police! Is anyone inside?" A voice called from the front door. I hurried to let them in, my body trembling as I swung the door open. Two officers stood there, one with a flashlight and the other with their hand on their holstered gun. "They're gone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But they were here. They broke in." "Don't worry," one of them said firmly. "We'll find them." I only hoped they were right. The officers wasted no time. One stayed with me, asking questions and jotting down notes in a small notepad. while the other began inspecting the shattered window and the rest of the house. I tried to keep my answers coherent, but my voice kept breaking, and my thoughts felt scrambled. Max stayed by my side, alert but calmer now, his presence grounding me in a way I desperately needed. "Can you describe the person you saw?" the officer asked, his pen hovering over the notepad. "They were tall," I said, closing my eyes to focus. "Broad shoulders, dark clothes. I couldn't see their face clearly. It was mostly in shadow, but they had a knife earlier, and when they broke in, they were holding a crowbar." "And you said they entered through the window?" he confirmed, glancing toward the broken glass. I nodded. "Yes, after trying to scare me by tapping on the windows and the back door. They didn't say a word the entire time, but they were deliberate. They wanted me to know they were there." The officer's brow furrowed as he scribbled notes. "And they ran out the same way they came in?" "Yes, I managed to fight them off when they cornered me in the hallway. They dropped the crowbar and bolted." The second officer returned, holding the crowbar in a gloved hand. "Found this near the window," he said, placing it in an evidence bag. "Looks like they were trying to intimidate you before escalating. Whoever it was left in a hurry." "Any sign of them outside?" the first officer asked. The second officer shook his head. "Not yet, but there's a trail of footprints leading toward the woods behind the property. We'll call an AK-9 unit to track them." Hearing that sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The first officer gave me a reassuring look. "It's unlikely. People like this thrive on fear and control. You showed them you're not an easy target by fighting back. That said, we'll increase patrols in the area for the next few nights, and you should consider installing cameras or additional security." I nodded, though the thought of sleeping in this house again made my stomach churn. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading fast, replaced by an overwhelming wave of exhaustion and dread. "Do you have anyone who can stay with you tonight?" the officer asked. "My brother," I said quickly. "He's on his way." As if on cue, headlights swept across the front windows, and I heard a car door slam. David burst through the door moments later, his face pale and full of concern. "Melissa, are you okay?" he asked, pulling me into a tight hug. "I'm fine," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm fine now." But as I hugged him back, my eyes drifted toward the shattered window, and I couldn't help but feel like the night wasn't truly over. Somewhere out there, in the dark, they were still watching. The house felt eerily quiet after the police and officers left. They had done their sweep, collected the evidence, and assured me that they'd keep an eye on the area. But their words, meant to comfort, did little to soothe my nerves. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, felt like it carried the potential for danger. David stayed close, his protective instincts in full gear. After the chaos of the night, he suggested we sit in the living room, keeping all the lights on while he brewed some tea. Max, still alert, lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws but his ears twitching at every little sound. I ran my fingers through his fur absent-mindedly, drawing comfort from his presence. "Do you want to talk about it?" David asked, handing me a mug and sitting across from me. His voice was gentle, careful not to push. I shook my head at first, staring into the swirling steam of the tea. But then the weight of it all became too much to keep inside. "They weren't just here to rob me," I said, my voice shaky. "They wanted me to know they were here. The way they moved, the way they tapped on the windows, it wasn't random. It was like they were playing a game." David's jaw tightened. "And you're sure you didn't recognize them? No one you've had issues with before?" "No," I said firmly. "I don't know anyone who would do something like this." It wasn't personal, it felt calculated, like they were testing me. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers in the shadows. "It doesn't make sense. Why target you? And why here in a quiet neighborhood? It's not like this is the kind of place where stuff like this happens." I swallowed hard, the same questions swirling in my mind. Maybe they've been watching for a while. Maybe this wasn't random at all. The thought made my skin crawl, How long had they been out there, lurking in the dark, studying my routines? David reached out and placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "You're not staying here alone again," he said firmly. "Not until this is over. I'll stay as long as you need, and tomorrow we're getting cameras installed. Whoever this was, we're going to make sure they can't come back without being seen." I nodded, grateful for his presence but still unsettled. I knew he was right. Cameras, locks, alarms, they were all necessary. But deep down, I wasn't sure they'd be enough. This person hadn't been deterred by locked doors or lights. They had broken in knowing I was inside. As I sipped my tea, my eyes drifted toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could still feel the weight of the night pressing against the glass. I knew that what happened tonight would stay with me long after the physical damage was repaired. Some fears don't fade with daylight. The next morning, the world outside felt deceptively normal. The sun rose, birds chirped, and the neighborhood seemed undisturbed, as if the night's terror had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the sight of the shattered window and the scratches on the RV told a different story. David and I stood in the backyard, surveying the damage in the harsh light of day. It felt surreal, like I was seeing someone else's home, someone else's nightmare. "This wasn't random," David said, breaking the silence. He crouched near the footprints that were still faintly visible in the dirt, following the trail that led to the treeline. Whoever this was, they knew how to move quietly, how to get in and out without leaving too much behind. But they made a mistake dropping that knife. I nodded, hugging Max's leash tightly. He sniffed the air, his usual playfulness replaced by a hyper-awareness that matched my own. The knife had been bagged and taken by the police, but the memory of its cold steel in my hand lingered. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a reminder of how close the danger had been. "We'll get cameras set up today," David continued. "I'll call a contractor to fix the window, and we'll reinforce the locks. You're not staying here alone, Mel. I'll make sure of that." I managed a small smile, grateful for his support. But deep down, I knew that no amount of security could erase what had happened. The knowledge that someone had invaded my space, had watched me, had played with my fear. It was a scar that no camera or lock could heal. As the day wore on, the practical tasks of cleaning up and adding security gave me a sense of control, albeit fleeting. The contractor arrived, measured the broken window, and promised to have it replaced within a day. A technician installed motion sensor cameras around the property, their small blinking lights a reassuring presence. David even bought a reinforced deadbolt for the back door and installed it himself. But despite all these precautions, the house didn't feel like home anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, sent my heart racing. Max stayed close, his protective instincts on high alert. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even in broad daylight. That night, as I lay in bed with Max curled up beside me, I replayed the events in my mind. The shadow in the trees, the knife on the ground, the deliberate tapping on the windows, the figure standing in my hallway, silent and menacing. It all felt like a twisted game, one where I didn't know the rules or the stakes. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless and fleeting. But in the moments of quiet, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let fear control me. This was my home, my life, and whoever had tried to take that from me wouldn't win. Still, as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't help but wonder, would they come back? And if they did, would I be ready? Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every creak in the house, every shadow in the corner of my eye, it's a reminder of that night. They never caught the person who invaded my home, and I've learned to live with the unease. But I still ask myself, were they watching me before that night? And are they still watching me now? Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your stories. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Turn on the notification bell, because the next story might just keep you up tonight. See you in the next one, if you can sleep.